Joe Swinson.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I'd like to start by also welcoming the Minister to her new position. I very much look forward to our exchanges both here and in Westminster Hall, although perhaps I hope not to spend quite so much time with her as with her predecessor, now that the EU Amendment Bill is on the statute book. It is an important time to have this debate. As has already been mentioned, this year we celebrate the 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the global values of equality, justice and the rule of law are as essential now as they were in 1948, when the horrors of World War II were fresh in people's memories. But despite the strides ahead that we have seen over the last 60 years, the catalogue of human rights abuses going on across the world hangs like a badge of shame around the world community's neck. This, I'm sure, will be, and has already been, a very wide-ranging debate, and as such, it is impossible to cover everything. But I want to, first of all, talk a little bit about, picking up on the point made by the Honourable Member for Walsall South about the importance of promoting democracy and human rights within the UK. I also want to discuss the role of women within human rights, and then touch on various countries and the situations in those. Like many members, I'm a member of Amnesty International, and I certainly find that when that magazine drops through the letterbox every couple of months, I really need to be in the right mindset and with a very strong stomach to open the pages and read what's inside. But I also think it's very important that we do that, that we don't turn a blind eye to the horrendous crimes that are going on across the world. And while it is daunting, I often find that there are just so many dreadful and appalling practices happening in so many countries, and it can often feel difficult as one individual, and perhaps it's somewhat easier for us as members of Parliament to feel that we can make a part of a difference, but for our constituents as well. While it is difficult to feel that we can make that difference, it is important to remember the values of organisations like Amnesty that do say that when people do join together, it is possible to achieve improvements in human rights, and the very well-documented impact that the letters that prisoners of conscience, for example, receive around the world, the impact that has on their day-to-day ability to get up and continue going through the dreadful existence they have, is actually very important. We obviously, as the UK, if we're going to lecture or promote or encourage democracy and human rights abroad, need to be very careful to ensure our own house is in order first. Otherwise, we will lose any authority we have on the world stage on that issue. And I think that there is a danger sometimes that this is the case for this country, particularly when our liberties here at home are being eroded. I do very much welcome the fact that the UK was one of the first countries, therefore, to undertake the Universal Periodic Review by the UN Human Rights Council, and in fact to be able to do so in a very constructive way to try and act as a benchmark to encourage other countries to embrace it in such a positive attitude as well. And that was one of the things that was picked up on in the way the UK dealt with it. Although it did make a variety of recommendations, and reading through the report and the recommendations which have in brackets after them the country that suggested it was quite interesting. I like the one in particular to have a strategic body to tackle violence against women, and in fact this is one that I've raised with the former Prime Minister and ministers on various occasions within this House, and is something that the End Violence Against Women Coalition is calling for. Very topically this week, one of the recommendations was that we should consider the legality of corporal punishment against children, and sadly we didn't have the opportunity last week to discuss and debate the amendment to that bill, but this may be something I'm sure that will come forward at a future date. And the other one that I was interested in was the fact that we should to have strict time limits on pre-charge detention. Interestingly enough, this one was suggested by Russia. When Russia's giving us good advice on human rights, I think it's a time to worry. I'd just like to take the House back briefly to 2004, on the 1st of July, column 454 in Hansard. And this was around the time that Robert Mugabe had extended detention without charge to 28 days in his Public Order Security Act. The then Foreign Secretary said, "The Zimbabwean authorities also continue to devise new powers to stamp out legitimate opposition, such as detention for up to a month without trial, which could be used to suppress dissent and protest." I think we really should
Only a month.
Muse on that. Yes, only a month. We should muse on that. That countries who are not necessarily where we would want to be on human rights, actually, we have been criticising them for things that we have then done ourselves. And of course, it's very topical today with the other place considering this issue of 42-day detention. And we, I'm sure, will see what the vote suggests. Although I think there is a great deal of hope from some, certainly on these benches, that that proposal will be turned down by the House of Lords, and possibly, if reports in the media are to be believed, possibly that will be accepted by the government. I could go on. There's a range of other issues where I think we should be putting our own house in order. The ambitious ID cards database, which goes far beyond what any other country is doing, and indeed, given the confidence that the public have in databases at the moment and the protection of their liberties for that, I think that is something which also should be thought again. The DNA database, 3.4 million people are in our DNA database, which is 5 times the proportion of the population on any other DNA database in the world. That includes 25,000 children who have never been charged with any offence. And I would perhaps just suggest that the government might want to learn from Scotland, where the DNA of innocent individuals cannot be held indefinitely. I'm
very grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving me. As a fellow Scottish MP, she'll know that one of the biggest democratic debacles we've actually witnessed in the last few years was the Scottish parliamentary elections in 2007. And will she support the calls, just recently made by the Scottish Parliament as recent as last week, to have those elections repatriated to the Scottish Parliament so that we never ever get in a situation where we get such a mess again?
Indeed, when the previous speaker was mentioning how wonderful the Electoral Commission was, I did have the elections from last May in my mind in Scotland, which certainly were not excellent. And I certainly believe that one of the recommendations in the aftermath of those elections that should be taken up by the government is that it should be up to the Scottish Parliament to look after its own elections, and that should be what happens. The other thing I would mention on the issue of democracy, it's 18 months since this House discussed the issue of House of Lords reform and voted overwhelmingly for an all-elected upper house, and yet it's taken over a year to get to a white paper stage, and the government does seem to be dragging its feet on this issue. So, while I will focus the rest of my remarks on human rights and democracy abroad, I would argue there's no room for complacency on these issues at home either. And in fact, if we were to have the assumption that we have it all sussed, then that actually could be perceived as arrogance and be counterproductive in international negotiations on the topic.
Would that be a youth? I'd be grateful. But I think my friend's going to go on to specific countries abroad. Can she agree that one of the things that we can do, and it picks up comments made elsewhere, is to build up the organisations based in the UK which allow reciprocal exchange of best practice? The British Council does it, the World Service does it, the Westminster Foundation does it, and there are many places which are willing to exchange staff, young politicians of the future, clerks from parliaments, not just new democracies, but countries which have become democracies and are still learning the way, but are very willing to share their experience. Countries like Ukraine, which is going through difficult times, but clearly is determined to get it right.
I very much agree with my honourable friend's point. The exchange of individuals, whether it's parliamentarians or indeed staff, clerks and so on, is something where we can all learn from each other. And on the occasions where I have been abroad, certainly to Sierra Leone with the Westminster Foundation for Democracy, I hope that I added value to that country and to the parliamentarians I met there, but I certainly came back from that experience with a much better understanding and a much more knowledge about the situation there, which I've found useful since. So I think it is something which indeed is very valuable. Turning to the issue of the role of women within democracy and human rights, which hasn't particularly been mentioned so far today, and indeed it is far too common and it's far too often that women are forgotten when discussing human rights and democracy, even though many of the worst perpetrations of human rights are against women. And indeed, in situations of conflict, it's often women and children who suffer the most. One thing which I'm particularly concerned about is that women are often not involved in the resolution of conflict and the post-conflict rebuilding of countries. Earlier this year, I visited Kosovo, and one of the people I met with was Iqbala Rogova, who's the director of the Kosovan Women's Network. And it was illuminating talking to her about her experiences after the conflict, when all the men were gathered into a room to discuss what to do next, and somebody from the UN came in, and after a bit of nudging, I think from some people from Britain actually, said, well, hang on, we don't have any women here, what are we going to do? And eventually, Iqbala and a couple of others were summoned along to be the token women in these discussions, and in fact they ended up being very influential in the discussions as they prepared exactly what they were going to say and got the questions set they wanted to ask. But often it's something, and that's even an example within Europe, it's often something which can be forgotten about. And indeed another anniversary that is coming up on October the 31st of this year that was the date in 2000 when UN Security Council Resolution 1325 was passed. 1325 requires parties in conflict to respect women's rights and indeed to support their participation in peace negotiations and post-conflict resolution. But 8 years on, sadly, there are still almost no women at the top levels in peace building and post-conflict reconstruction.
Will the Honourable Lady allow me?
I will give way to both honourable gentlemen, but in just 1 second. So I hope the Minister would consider what action the Government might be able to take to strengthen Resolution 1325, whether a stronger resolution with more teeth is required, and whether that's something which we should be arguing for at the UN. First of all,
I'm extremely grateful to the Honourable Lady, to whose speech I'm listening with interest and respect. I welcome very much what she says about women's rights and involvement. Of course we can't, Mr Deputy Speaker, change the world overnight, but on the principle that he who pays the piper calls the tune, surely we can exert some influence. Would the Honourable Lady share my horror, certainly a horror shared by the Right Honourable Gentleman Member for Gordon, that when the International Development Select Committee visited some women's projects in a number of African countries over the last few years, we have been, frankly, taken aback by the fact that the speeches have been invariably delivered by the men, and women, including highly qualified graduates and master's graduates, were left serving the tea. We were paying for those projects. Surely we can do something about it.
The Honourable Gentleman makes a very salient point, and indeed something which I hope will be taken up by those both planning the visits but perhaps running those projects. And I'm quite sure that the Honourable Gentleman and indeed my honourable friend will not have let that experience go unnoted at the time.
I completely concur with our concerns on that particular matter, and actually relating to that, will she accept our disappointment too that in the last year in Afghanistan, nearly all of the women ministers have been removed from the government. Indeed, the only woman left in the government is the Minister of Women Affairs, which they didn't feel was appropriately done by a man. And is that not a regrettable indication that actually the commitment for 1325 and the commitment to women is very, very superficial in many of these countries?
I wholeheartedly endorse what my honourable friend says, and in fact I was just about to come on to Afghanistan, where the position of women under the Taliban was of course very well documented: no access to education, being treated like second-class citizens, draconian controls on movement and freedoms. And as an aside, I would wholeheartedly recommend to the House a fictional novel based on fact that I read over the summer, 1,000 Splendid Suns, about the position of women in Afghanistan, which I think demonstrated quite how terrible the situation had become. But since the fall of the Taliban, one might have expected that the situation would be much improved. And while some girls do get access to education now within Afghanistan, the situation is still dire. And I was intrigued when the Minister read out a list at the end of her speech of individuals who have made a particular contribution to fighting for human rights. And I've got another one to add to her list, and that is Malalai Joya, who is the youngest member of the Afghan Parliament, who last Monday was in London to be awarded the Anna Politkovskaya Award for her courage and dedication in trying to protect human rights in her country. And after that, Malalai came to Westminster, and I was fortunate enough to be able to meet her and to interview her, in fact, for Women's Parliamentary Radio. And her bravery was just so inspirational. It was actually a very humbling experience. What she faces on a day-to-day basis just makes what we as MPs in this country do pale into insignificance. For the crime of speaking up and suggesting that crimes against women should be punished, and that those who are even now in positions of power but who in fact were warlords who were on the rampage and raping and killing, that these people should be brought to justice, and suggesting that the Parliament is not being strong enough on these issues. She has been suspended from the Parliament. So where is the freedom of speech there? When she was in the Parliament, she had bottles thrown at her and abuse and death threats hurled at her. She has had 4 assassination attempts and has to sleep every night in a different house as she continually is at risk. And I just think that to have individuals like her, they are a fabulous inspiration. But it is so sad that, first of all, that there are not enough people like her speaking up, and indeed that is still necessary in a country where we are investing so much and where we ought to have more influence to try to prevent these things happening. Even just hearing some of the stories, she showed me a video speaking to a 12-year-old girl who had been gang raped, and of course there had been no punishment to the perpetrators, and of course that's not a one-off horrific situation that is unusual. That is what is happening day in and day out. And of course it's not just women in Afghanistan who are suffering, the whole country is on a knife edge. And if we fail to secure lasting peace and security there, that will have major implications for our ability to promote democracy and human rights worldwide. There is well-documented claims of the fact that our military are overstretched at the moment, trying to fight on both fronts in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And indeed, just recently hearing the Iraqi Prime Minister say that it's time for the UK troops to go, I hope the government will do what from these benches we have been arguing for some time, and actually withdraw the troops from Iraq so that there can be more of a focus on Afghanistan, where it is absolutely vital that we succeed in our objectives. And turning briefly to Iraq, I do believe that our experience there has been disastrous for our credibility abroad in promoting democracy and human rights. And when I visited the UN earlier this year and spoke to various diplomats, the feeling was very much the same, that it does undermine what we are trying to do elsewhere. And it's in some ways ironic that improving the humanitarian situation in Iraq was often quoted, albeit after the event, as one of the reasons for our intervention there. But the lack of planning for rebuilding the Iraqi state after the military action was entirely unforgivable. It was such a mistake, and it is responsible for some of the appalling violations of human rights that we have seen in Iraq since 2003. And I think the figures actually just speak volumes. Since 2003 in Iraq, we have spent £6.6 billion on the war, and we have spent £125 million on humanitarian assistance. And that shows where the priorities are, and I think that needs to change. Just one further point on Iraq before I move on. It's nearly 18 months since 5 British men were seized at the finance ministry in Iraq and taken hostage. One can only begin to imagine the agony that their families have been facing for this past year and a half. And I hope that the Minister might be able to just give an assurance that every effort is being made in the ongoing negotiations to secure the release of these men as soon as is possible.
Will my friend allow me one more time? Very quickly. I'm very grateful. Can I really just reinforce that if we go to war without UN authority, if we pass laws that detain people without trial, then we are absolutely prevented, and I've heard it in places like Pakistan, from going to countries like Pakistan and Afghanistan for arguing that they must protect human rights. We have become incredible, and what we do at home has a direct effect on our ability to influence these things in all the other countries of the world.
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and of course he makes his point very eloquently and is quite right. Just to turn to mention briefly a few other countries, we have heard obviously about the difficulties over the summer with the Russia and Georgia situation, and the implications for human rights there are obviously wide-ranging, not just indeed in Georgia but in the other vulnerable states in that area and in that region more generally. And of course the deterioration of our relationship with Russia is a great cause for concern, not something that is necessarily easy to rebuild and put right, but I think a strong unified EU response is absolutely vital. And the Honourable Member for Aylesbury was quite right to also call for a strong EU pressure on the Asian countries as regards Burma, which I would very much like to echo many of his comments on that, where we have seen, and of course the fabulous work done by the Honourable Member in the all-party group, we have seen the dreadful situation, particularly in the response to the natural disaster there earlier this year. And briefly on China, I mean, the lack of democracy in China is well documented. I visited China earlier this year on a select committee trip, and we had 2 hours off in the entire trip to explore Beijing. And I went to the Tiananmen Square and to the Forbidden Garden and spoke to the guide that I had and tried to engage them in a political discussion and said, what do you think of Chairman Mao? What's your opinion? And it was just like a blank wall, almost, and she had very good English. It wasn't that she didn't understand the question in terms of the language, it was that she didn't understand the concept that one might have an opinion about a political leader, and in fact that might possibly be a critical political opinion.
the Honourable Lady. On the subject of Tiananmen Square, is she aware that if you use the Google internet site in China and you type in Tiananmen Square, you get a very different set of results back from if you type in Tiananmen Square into Google here in the UK? What does she think that says about China's approach to controlling modern forms of communication and its commitment to freedom of communication and speech?
I think what it says is that China is determined to put huge resources into trying to control the internet. I understand it's 50,000 individuals they have shutting down internet sites. But what I would say is that I don't believe that it will be sustainable in the long run. I think actually one of the wonders and the joys of the internet is that it will be a great vehicle for improving democracy, for showing people that in the world outside it is different, and in fact that human rights are something which they could and should have too. I myself was on holiday in Cuba this year, and they have a similar situation where as a foreigner you're allowed to use the internet, but it is very much restricted for locals, and indeed even for foreigners. You have internet rationing. But they obviously don't have the same resources that China has to block certain sites, although following some of the political news did still prove slightly difficult. But I do think the internet will actually be a mechanism to promote this kind of freedom, and I think it's like trying to sort of empty the Atlantic with a teaspoon, or whatever the correct analogy is, that China will try to do that, but they ultimately will not be successful.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. Has the Honourable Lady had the opportunity to read Mark Leonard's excellent book, What Does China Think?, where that book actually demonstrates that there's huge debate across China, and in fact there are more think tanks looking at different political methods and different ways of moving China forward politically than actually exist in this country. And that sometimes it can be simplistic to think that debate is not taking place in China. It's just not taking place in a form that we would understand.
And clearly there is a situation in China where what you say and where you say it is something where people have to be very careful, and that does not necessarily mean that people aren't thinking about these things. I'm sure the book that she references will be one that honourable members would be interested to indeed have a look at, and she makes a very good point. Turning to Zimbabwe, I'm sure there is dismay felt across the House at the events that we've seen take place over the weekend with Mugabe's power grab. And after there was that little chink of optimism with the signing of the agreement on the 15th of September, it now is beginning to look like nothing more than a delaying tactic on behalf of Mugabe. Last Tuesday in Foreign and Commonwealth Office questions, the Foreign Secretary said, and this was column 128, Mr Shangarai is ready to work with Mr Mugabe on the distribution of cabinet portfolios, and that is the key test now. Clearly Mugabe has failed that test. I would like to hope the Minister, in summing up, will say what action the government is taking to increase the international pressure on Mugabe to reverse this weekend's power grab, whether or not they still believe that that the current system is sustainable in terms of actually trying to get the result that we want, or whether we're going to have to try to perhaps bring a new mediator in to get some progress. We do need also, I would argue, some consistency from government on Zimbabwe. The Foreign Office has been very good at urging the promotion of human rights and trying to stop the torture and the bloodshed and condemning the actions of Mugabe, and I'm sure they have been pursuing all the diplomatic channels to try to get movement in that country. But at the same time, the Home Office is having legal arguments to try to send back asylum seekers that are fleeing the very torture that the Foreign Office is condemning. And there are some failed refugees who have been in detention centres in this country for 2 years. Now, is that really the kind of human rights that we want to be promoting, and is that really going to give us the moral authority to criticise Zimbabwe's human rights? So I would just like to ask how the government can possibly have a clear conscience on this matter. Surely Zimbabweans here must be allowed to work to support themselves while this current situation is ongoing. And finally, to turn to the country of the United States of America, which I think proves that democracy is no guarantee of human rights. I welcome the Minister's strong condemnation of waterboarding, which is one of the torture methods apparently sanctioned by the US. And not only is this country condoning torture, but it uses the death penalty, including on some young men and women, and it has the illegal and the immoral stain of Guantanamo Bay on its conscience. Finally, the government did secure the release of the UK citizens, although I note there is still one UK resident, in fact, currently up for one of these military commissions or kangaroo courts, which certainly does not conform to the standards of justice that we would hope for and expect. And also, I would just like to say that it took the government far too long far too long to act on Guantanamo. And it was shocking. I remember ministers referring to it as an anomaly and refusing to condemn it and refusing to say that it should be closed. And we always welcome a sinner that repents, but it did take too long. And it's, I suppose, of some cause for optimism that both candidates for the US presidency have talked about closing Guantanamo Bay, and I would argue that it must be the top priority for the US president if they are to have any moral authority on democracy and human rights on the world stage. Before I conclude, Mr Deputy Speaker, I would just like to apologise to the House that a prior commitment clashes with this debate having been delayed because the statement means I won't be able to stay to hear the next two speakers, but I do intend to come back as soon as I can to the debate to hear the rest of it. Effective international institutions are of course very important for the aims of improving human rights through the EU, through the UN, NATO, Council of Europe, the Commonwealth and beyond. And the closer cooperation across government with our foreign counterparts is actually crucial to the security of this country. It's important that respect for human rights and the liberty of the individual are not undermined in the name of security. The UK must play a role on the international stage to promote human rights and encourage democracy. The challenges are huge, and the UK's position has been sadly undermined by our actions in Iraq. But nonetheless, we must redouble our efforts, and I hope that the mooted and supposed government U-turn that may come shortly on 42 days is a sign the government also is keen to safeguard human rights in the UK. That, indeed, would be a step in the right direction to give us back the authority to be a positive influence for democracy and human rights in the rest of the world.
Yeah.